Hello guys. Today we will learn about promise chaining with a simple example. Now let us look at this example where we have two functions. First is get tax identification number, and this function needs an employee ID and returns you the tax identification number of the employee. We have another function called get employee tax amount, which expects the tax identification number which we get from the previous function, and it returns me the tax the employee has to pay. But the catch is both these functions are taking time. So in a way, they are asynchronous, which means we need a promise to solve this issue. So now let us try to solve this problem. Starting with first, I'm going to implement a promise here. Let promise O be equal to new of promise. Inside that, provide a function with resolve reject. And then I'm going to move this particular piece of code inside the function. Let's indent it properly. Okay. So now this is done. What do we need to do next is, instead of return, we will use resolve to send the operation result. And then we will also return the promise object. Same as we have done in the previous example. Now, same type of logic needs to be implemented here as well inside the next function. We will move the code now again inside the function and indent the code and return the promise object again. So now, as we can see, we have implemented the promise. Now, how do we solve this problem? Well, as we understand that the first function takes some time, returning the tax identification number, and the second function takes the input from the first function and returns the result. Of course, this return should also be resolved because we are using promises here. Okay. We don't always need to use reject. In fact, if resolve is doing, for now, let it be. Now, let us understand this particular piece of code with a simple arrow diagram. So we are basically having an input, and the input is employee ID, and then this is provided to a function. This function is get tax identification number, which is this one, and it returns me the tax identification number if we provided the employee ID. So let's write down here returns TIN, which is the tax identification number. And what's the job of this function? Basically, returns TIN of employee. Simple. Now we have another function which takes input of this return value, which is the TIN, and then returns you the exact tax amount. So let us again get back with the next function. And this particular function is expecting the TIN as an input, and the output we get is the tax amount. So here it is the final output, which is tax amount. And this function is actually the function here, which is get employee tax amount. And let us also write here what it returns. Returns the tax amount of employee. Correct? So this is the flow of the application where we have two functions which take time, but one function needs the return value of another function. Now, how do we solve it? We will go first with the simpler way, but not the most efficient way, which is we can do nesting. That means first we can resolve the first promise, and inside the then function, we will call the second function and then again resolve the promise. So let us now try to implement this. Coming back here again, let's try to solve it. So coming back, let me write now return promise or result. Yeah, result promise OB1 equal to get tax identification number, provide the employee, which is James123, which is of course static, and then we will write result OB promise 1 dot then, and inside this we get the tin as a response. We will just do the console.log. Tin is the value which is returned. Now again, we will make a request inside this function to the get employee tax amount. So again, I will write let result promise OB2 equal to get employee tax amount, provide the tin which we have received inside this function. And again, we will do result promise OB2 dot then, and inside this, we will get the tax amount. So we will just console.log the tax amount. So now we will also add a catch. So see how complicated it becomes. Now again, we have to write result OB1 dot catch in case if something goes wrong. And then let's just console.log the error message. And we need to apply one more catch here also inside, right? Because the second request can also fail for some reason. So dot catch, and then again we will write here if something goes wrong, then the error message. Well, as you can see here, for two promises itself, the nesting becomes complex, as we can see here, and code becomes slightly complex and confusing also. Now imagine a situation where we have, let us say, 3 or 4 levels of request where we are getting an input from one function, providing the input to another function, and so on. Our code will be then fairly complex. So let us first try to run this piece of code and see if it is working. All right, we can see that this is working fine. Tin we received inside the function, and then finally we also get the tax amount. So as we can see, our code is working fine. And we can also compare the output with the code in case if you want to. So let me just so these are my console messages here, and I believe it is working fine. You see these two because I'm also printing it here inside the function and one inside the result. But as discussed, this is a complex code, but promises gives us the capability to make it simple. So let's now go to the efficient way of solving this issue. So now let us again remove all this piece of code and see how we can simplify it. So now we can do something called chaining. So what does that mean is that I can do chaining of my code. So I can just write here result promise ob1. Yeah, ob1 dot, then same as we did before. Then what do? We again write here promise ob2 equal to and make a request again with the value that we have received. But we return this promise also. So let us again understand the code. So what we are doing here is we are first making a request to the first function. We get a promise, and then inside the then of it, we again make a request to the function, the second function, but we return a promise again. So we return a promise again, which means we can again do a then. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, one of the ways would be to directly use then again here. Yes, we can do that. So we'll use dot then, which means whatever it is returning, I'm again chaining it with another then. And inside that, I can write here tax amount. And then I can just do a console.log of tax amount, or the tax amount is the value that we have received. Simple. Now, let us try to again run this piece of code and see if we are able to get the output. I'm going to remove these console messages because they kind of look confusing. So now what we have done, very simple. We did a then, but now we returned the promise of the second function, which can be resolved inside that then, which is chained to this code. And now let us see the output. Reload. And so some issue has happened. I see the tax amount is received, correct? But I should also, in fact, just display here the first resolution. So I'm going to write console.log, and that tin number is the value that we received. Yeah, that value that we received. So what are we doing is that I'm just going to show you step by step the resolution of the first and the second promise. Let's try to run this piece of code again. And what do I get here? First promise should resolve. 10 I received. Then the second one, and the tax amount is received. Correct? Let's look at the comparison. And you can see how simple my code is, isn't it? Because what I'm doing is I'm doing chaining. Chaining means I can again chain, because this particular piece of code returns what? A promise. Now, if this is looking confusing to you, I will again break it down. So let us try to break this piece of code again. And this function here then now returns what? A new promise. So we will write let promise ob2 equal to this particular piece of code, correct? Or maybe let me just try to remove this now. And here I'm going to write let promise ob2 equal to the result promise ob1 dot then, because it is returning a promise, remember. And then again I can write result promise ob2 dot then, and inside that I can again display the amount, which is the tax amount. It is the same thing, but now I have broken it down, because this might look a little confusing in the beginning, that how am I doing the chaining. So for simplicity, I'm telling you that this particular function then now returns a promise, which is again resolved outside. So we can see again that the code is not nested, correct? And one more thing, how do we handle errors? Well, I can just write result ob2 dot catch and handle the error. We can do that also. So inside this catch, I'm going to write error message and just do a console.log of error message. All right, now let us again try to run this piece of code and see the output. So first code ran and is giving the right output. Second one is also running fine. Now, what happens if there is an error? Because there is one natural question that will come, that I am only handling the catch using the second one, not the first one, isn't it? So it looks little confusing now. So how do we handle the error is something which we need to understand now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to somehow, instead of resolve, throw an error in the reject. Okay, and give a message can't get in. Just write this thing. I think there is even a better technique. I can just write an else, and here I can write reject can't get in. And same thing I can do here also, because I have an if, so I can write an else. And here, if I don't get the exact value, I can write can't get X amount, the error on the second promise. So now we are handling the resolve as well as reject. Okay, so now let us see what happens if, let us say, instead of James 1, 2, 3, I provide 1, 2, 3, 4. And now let us again try to run this piece of code. Can't get tin, right? Which is the error message here on line number 44, which is coming here. But can't get tin is on promise 2, is on promise 2, which is handling the failure of promise 1. which means this one single catch is sufficient. I do not need to write two catch here. One is sufficient only for this as well as for this. You see, I just failed the first one. Now, what happens if I fail the second one? How do I do that? Maybe the value that I'm providing here, 10, I'm giving some wrong value. And let us try to again run this piece of code. So as we can see, the first promise should pass and the second one should fail. And again, we are able to get the error. That is the beauty of it, that both the promises errors can be handled in one catch, can be handled in one catch. That is what is so good about using nested promises. And that is one important thing which I wanted to show you. Now, let us try to clean this code. Instead of all these, we will just remove the variables and just write a simpler way, which is directly write the dot then here. Yeah, directly write the dot then here. Yeah, dot then. And similarly, the dot catch. So this is how we usually write code, where dot then and then again chain the then and again chain the catch. And if I again want to run this piece of code, we will see that this should work fine. First promise resolved, second promise fails. So it shows me the issue. Now, let's see a total working code. Again, coming back here, let me reload and first promise resolved, very nice. Value is proper. Second also works fine. So that is what I was trying to tell you. And that is the way in which we can handle nested promises. Now, this particular piece of code is fairly simple, as you can see. However, it's important to understand that this particular scenario can also be used for server requests, which means when I'm making a request to the server, then in that situation, there is a delay introduced by the server request. That is also asynchronous. So if I want to get an output of, if I want to get an input to another request from another request, then that can be also achieved. We will understand this with a working example in the next session.